Welcome everybody to CWI Media. Today we are going to talk about the global uprising that is taking place right now. Before we go into that discussion, I will request everybody who's watching to share and then like our pages, and also please go to the YouTube channel and then subscribe to the channel. Today we are going to talk about a very important development that's taken place across the world. Following the George Floyd, a brutal, horrendous killing, a massive uproar emerged, uprising, particularly among the young people, not just in the US but across the world. This is also exposing an already existing rotten conditions in many countries. This is taking place at the time of this lockdown and the corona crisis. Many are losing their loved ones, trying to struggling to go by a daily basis, and then they come together to protest. Imagine the anger that exists in the society. And we wanted to share with you some of the protests that are taking place across the world, some of them, because it's only limited time today. And you can go to our socialistworld.net website to follow other reports. Today we have invited a comrade from the US, Jai, and from England and Wales, Isaipriya, and also from Birmingham we are invited Deji, and then Scotland, important movement developed there as well, Wayne, and then all of them will give some reports, and we'll also show you some videos in relation to what's happening in these areas and so on. First of all, Jai, will you give us some examples and report about what's going on in the US current situation? Give us also a little bit flavor about what's the composition, what's the kind of anger, and etc. Jai.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. The nature of the protests in the U.S. Is truly inspiring. It has been an overwhelmingly multiracial movement of workers and youth, and really, as you alluded to, tons of youth being involved in the movement, with elements of the middle class and firmament as well, coming out to show their support. To give you an idea of just how involved young people are in this movement, in a relatively small industrial city, in the smallest state in the country, high school students initiated and led a 10,000 person protest just this past Friday. The movement has really spread all throughout the country in a way that we have not seen in truly decades, including Hawaii and Alaska even. And even in communities that are, predominantly white, we have seen people coming out in droves in support of this emerging anti-racist movement, fighting alongside their natural tendency of the working class and the youth towards unity. But it's not just big cities. There are numerous small industrial cities that have joined the movement, including Worcester, where the Independent Socialist Group, the organization that is co-thinkers with the CWI in the US, where we are one of the cities in which we are largely based. There's been major protests in Worcester, some of which we have initiated ourselves, in nearby cities that we are trying to build in and that have a few members in Northampton have also had huge protests, unlike anything we've seen in recent history. And as of now, our organization is largely concentrated in the Northeast, and we have joined alongside many of the protests happening in the region, from the major protests in Worcester and Northampton, to intervening in Providence and Rhode Island, the previously mentioned 10,000 person protest that was truly amazing, in all throughout Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Connecticut, as well as importantly the two most major cities nearest to our strongest political base being Boston and New York City, where the energy is incredibly high and there's a readiness throughout the country, but especially in the major cities, in these youth-led movements, readiness and a need to systematically rethink how policing is structured in the country. And this is a mood that is only spreading. If you go on social media, it's completely flooded with everyone talking about this sort of current period. It has really taken over the entire sort of political conversations that are going on in the US, and has really pushed even the elections that are still going to be contentious into the background. And everyone is focused on, well, what are you doing to fight against police brutality? What are you doing to fight against systemic racism? Is at the forefront of everyone's mind. People are ready to fight for radical change. There are attempts by by sort of more liberal-minded people, particularly the Democratic Party politicians, to direct all this energy just try and push it towards the next election. But there's an awareness to go beyond that. There's a lack of willingness to just submit to that, as has been done in prior, for example, the previous uprising of Black Lives Matter in 2014 to 2016. Where sort of much of the energy was just pushed into the Democratic Party. There's a strong resistance against that. Not saying an inoculation of that won't happen, but as of now, people are ready and waiting for results and will not stop fighting until they get them. One of the major demands that has arisen and that is gaining massive popularity is defunding the police, and instead investing so much of the incredibly bloated budgets of police departments, shrinking those down, shrinking the role of the police, and instead using so many of these funds to invest in actual community support, such as mental health services, housing, healthcare, jobs, things that can revitalize our communities and undercut poverty, which is the real, and poverty and capitalism is the real cause of so much of the crime that exists, the vast majority of it that exists throughout the world, really. There's also been, pushes for numerous institutions to break ties with local police departments, especially universities, and even now there's a strong push to remove cops in middle and high schools. That has been this sort of the strong furthering of sort of the school to prison pipeline in many communities of color, particularly predominantly Black schools. And this fight has been taken up and won a victory in Minneapolis in particular, in which the University of Minnesota has cut all ties with the Minneapolis Police Department, as well as its Minneapolis Public Schools doing the same. And there's even elements of that happening in Worcester as well, and one of our major sort of prestigious universities, Clark University, cutting ties with the Worcester Police Department as well. And basically, the movement is unwilling to settle for kind words, and unwilling to just bend to the Democratic Party's promises. Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York, was booed off the stage for failing to actually put forward a real program. Mayor Jacob Frey of Minneapolis came out to show solidarity at one of the protests, and when he refused to commit to defunding and abolishing the police as we know it and rebuilding it with a more just system, he was booed off and forced to do a walk of shame.
Yes, that's Chai from Independent Socialist Group in the US, co-thinkers of CWI. I wanted to bring in Isai Priya to give you a flavor of what's going on in England and Wales. Isai Priya is a National Committee member of Socialist Party of England and Wales. Isai, can you give us a little bit of details in terms of it's inspired by what's happening in the US, but also has a unique qualities and properties emerging in this movement? Can you give us a little bit of details about that?
Thank you very much, Senan. And I think, first of all, it's really difficult to put a figure on how massive the protests have been across UK. We predict that in London alone over the weekend that maybe 150, 60,000 were on the streets as a bare minimum, I would say. And across the UK, we have intervened in 30 protests, and we estimate that across those 30 protests that maybe 350,000 protesters have taken part. And this is a bare minimum that we think. It has been absolutely amazing. And to just echo the point that Jai made as well, they have been incredible. And in the Socialist Party here in England and Wales, we had 190 comrades across the country intervening in these demonstrations and protests. And we have given out more than 20,000 leaflets. And that was all that we could print in a very short period of time. We sold 975 copies of our Socialist paper, which is an indication of how open these protesters are to our ideas. And as an organizer in the London Socialist Party, I can fairly say that I've been on a number of protests and demonstrations over the last years. But these Black Lives Matter demonstrations are nothing of that sort. They have been absolutely amazing. And as the CWI has put out a statement yesterday, which I encourage everyone to go and read, we are in a new period, all changed and utterly changed is the phrase that we use. We had flurry of people queuing up, approaching our store, waiting to get our leaflets, waiting to sign our petition, patiently listening to ideas that we were putting forward of the need to build a mass united movement to smash racism. They were agreeing with everything that we were saying. And what we noticed was the heightened level of anti-capitalism but also the high level of class consciousness that was amongst these protesters. This truly was a mass uprising of working class youth of all background, but large section from a black background, black and Asian background, angry, vibrant, and willing to fight and get the ideas and really taking them on. We had more than 1,200 who signed up our petition and are wanting to find out more about the Socialist Party, but wanting to join us in that fight. And we, in London, for example, we've been calling around those names that we got in the region. And the discussion they've been having, most of them want to discuss socialist ideas with them. And we've been saying things like you can't have racism without, you can't have capitalism without racism, the need to fight against racism, class inequality, against poverty, exploitation, and the need to fight for jobs and homes for everyone. And they were literally like welcomed amazingly. And just to give you one example, I had a conversation with a person that we met over the weekend over the phone. And I started off by saying we need to smash racism, and they immediately stopped me and said, no, we need to smash capitalism. These are the conversations that we're having with these contacts, and it's been amazing. I mean, some of us are still buzzing from the weekend, and it is different, and I think it's different for a number of issues. I think the pandemic has exposed in a very sharp way, the inequality that exists within capitalism, and it's no accident that Black, Asian, ethnic minorities are disproportionately affected by the pandemic. There are some shocking figures, but just to say a few, in the UK, if you're from a black background, you're 4 times more likely to die from COVID-19, and if you're from an Asian background, then you're 3 times more likely to die. And this is not an accident. It is because Black, Asian, ethnic minorities are largely key workers, have been working during the pandemic, with majority of them without adequate PPE. They are some of the low-paid workers living in crowded accommodation, and they are subjected to brutal policies of the right wing that have been pushed forward by the Tories and the New Labour as well. And it's also shocking in terms of institutionalised racism that's taking place in the UK as well, which has been heightened in this movement. It is not, one of the chants that came out is that UK is not innocent. And I think that's because fighting racism is not an issue for the US alone, it's across the world. And in Britain, we have some statistics where the Home Office has predicted that if you're a black person in England and Wales, that you are 9.5 times more likely to be stopped and searched. You're also, and we also see an increase in stop and search in London, for example, during the pandemic in March and April, of 22% of black origins being searched. But we're also seeing in the Metropolitan Police, for example, shocking figures that if you're from a black person, then if you're from a black origin, black and Asian, then you're more likely to be used force by the police in the way they deal with you. And these are like figures that have actually came out during the pandemic, and I think the movements that are taking place are expressing that. And one other thing I would say about this difference that has been intervening in these protests is the increase in consciousness amongst these young people. Like, I think that is also the effect of the pandemic as well. Like, who runs a society and the economy? Because it is the working class. After years of being neglected, after years of being pushed aside by the government, like low pay, long hours, we finally, it's pushed to us that it is the key workers that make the economy run. And some of these youth that turned up in this protest would have been on those key workers working part-time in retail and other sections of the society. And the other thing I think is also very interesting in terms of the expression of anger, because during the pandemic, we have been careful, we have stayed home and protected ourselves and our families and friends, and acted in one and solidarity as together. And then we see people like Dominic Cumming, who is twisting the rules to suit his needs. And also, worst of all, while we're trying to protect lives, we're seeing a black, unarmed, innocent man being killed by the police brutally in the streets of the US. That itself is sparking massive anger. And we would say that there are moments in history that spark a movement, and that a moment in history where it expresses the anger that has been accumulated. And the killing of George Floyd was such a moment. And it would be wrong for us to conclude that this is just about killing of a one man. No, this is a massive uprising that's taking place against institutionalized racism, against poverty, against unemployment, and against oppression. And the main chant over the weekend, as well as Black Lives Matter, No Justice, No Peace, was "We Want Change." And the youth of today, who are, with a new and worsened economic crisis, have no hope for a decent future. And we can talk about the shocking unemployment figures in the US and UK alone. And these youth are forced to fight for a better future. And the youth of today is different to the youth that was before the pandemic. They're more angry, they want to fight for a better future, and they are open for socialism, and they need to fight for jobs and homes.
Thanks, Isai. It's a very extremely promising report. What happened was horrendous, very inhumane. The point is that it's been happening for years and years and years. Now, what's happening in terms of in opposition to that, an emergence of this movement, and that's what we say is wonderful, is that no longer we are prepared to tolerate this. And this is, like Isai said, that it gave a good picture of what's going on in relation to that particular movement. But it's not in London parts of the world, but also in UK. And we wanted to bring in Deji from Birmingham to kind of give her give a little bit of a graphic picture in terms of what's going on in that part of UK. Deji, can you give us some details about what's the protest and so on like that?
Yeah, definitely. I've been able to speak in Birmingham and Coventry, and other members of the Socialist Party have been active all across the West Midlands. And this is a raw grassroots movement led by young black women and men that are tired of the oppression that they're facing every day. Although it was sparked by the brutal killings of George Floyd, you can tell that these young people have been waiting for an opportunity to express their anger at the system and to try and enact real change. Many young people have taken the microphone and shared stories of family members who have been killed at the hands of the police, experiences of police raids in their family home, and the wider issues such as the tragedy of Grenfell Tower and the lack of quality healthcare. That wasn't just a passion for change in the UK, but also around the world. Most British black people like myself are only first or second generation immigrants, so they're strongly aware of the damage that's being ravaged by capitalism on the working class in Africa and across the Caribbean. They know that the wealth and the resources in Africa have been stolen for profit, and there were calls to fix the British education system, which has intentionally ignored the country's crimes of colonialism and imperialism, because the capitalists ruling the country know that their wealth was built on the backs of the African working class and the British working class. Importantly, people didn't just want to demonstrate, they were eager to get organized, and new leaders and revolutionary organizations were springing up, trying to organize like political education and also to tackle issues ranging from housing, pay, and mental health. In Coventry, the crowds were excited by my speech, calling on us to learn from the Black Panthers, to read Fred Hampton, and to read Marx. This really speaks to growing levels of class consciousness that these protests are causing. This really is a sign of the radicality of the Zoomer generation as well. People were promoting Instagram pages with revolutionary quotes and anti-capitalist images. The youth took control and were lapping around Coventry on the motorway, blocking up roads, and people were emerging from their homes to try and join in. The march in Coventry was so fast-paced that I was struggling to keep up. And that's because it was led by teenagers and it was led by young adults chanting the names of those that had died due to police brutality. People like Darren Cumberbatch in Coventry, but also those who had died to racism around the UK, such as Shukri Abdi and Stephen Lawrence. In Wolverhampton, there were over 1,000 people. In Coventry, there are over 1,500 people. In Birmingham, there are over 15,000 people. And by the end of the demonstrations, we had given away most of our flyers and papers. Hundreds of people left us their details, wanting to find out more and trying to find out how to get more involved. The Socialist Party has since been attempting to coordinate parts of the movement. Just yesterday, I was in a Zoom call with 80 people, and they were sharing their frustrations and looking for ways to organize. We're already helping to build and coordinate for the next protests in the region, and some further away ones in Birmingham and Coventry. Beyond the protests, we're planning further Zoom meetings, and we're also planning outdoor meetings. But I think it's also important to raise the fact that at some stage, the police won't be holding back like they have been in the West Midlands. We'll also need to talk about stewarding and safety, and possibly the defence of our movement from the state and the far right. We've already seen rumours of the far right marching in London on Saturday against our movement. So we need the trade unions and we need the working class to help defend against these attacks. And they need to be involved in part of the democratic discussions that are happening around the issues of racism and police brutality. The protests have helped to radicalise a whole generation of working class youth of every colour, race and ethnicity. And they've instinctively taken to the streets because they don't have political representation. Just yesterday, the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, was on the radio saying that it was wrong to tear down the statue of the slaver in Bristol. Like, it just shows how disconnected he is from the issue. But the Socialist Party is connected to the movement. Our rolling megaphone in Birmingham is speakers from all areas and all different colours. We've had people shouting about imperialism, poverty, racism and sexism, and the need to get rid of capitalism. Just to conclude, I'll raise some of the points I was raising at the protests. Now's the time to decide what type of world we want to live in, to get the radical socialist change. To get radical socialist change, we need to agitate, educate and organise. These protests have shown that we're agitated, but now's the time to educate and organise ourselves. I'll just repeat what got huge cheers at the protests in Coventry and Birmingham. For racial justice, we need socialist policies. For the Windrush generation, we need socialist change. For the victims of Grenfell, we need socialist change. And to get justice for Stephen Lawrence and the others that have been murdered because of the colour of their skin and their class, we need socialist change. And for all the victims of police brutality, we need socialist change. Freddie Hampton, leader of the Black Panther Party, built a rainbow coalition uniting white people, Asian people and black people against racism, sexism and capitalism. And I'll finish with his words. We're going to fight racism, not with racism, but we're going to fight it with solidarity. We're not going to fight capitalism with black capitalism, but we're going to fight it with socialism. Thank you.
That's a very, very inspiring report, Deji. So no wonder you're very popular, very quite articulately we put it there in terms of the chanting about the need for socialism in that big numbers, and then getting involved and understanding, connecting what's going on in terms of the racism, the attack against the BME workers to the system and so on. And then it's an emergence of new movement, which is why it's so promising and exciting, because we have an opportunity to set back the ongoing horrendous situation. But also in the other part, in Scotland also, we have seen a big movements there, and we wanted to bring in Wayne. Are you there? We want to bring in Wayne to kind of give us a little report about what's going on. Wayne?
Yeah. Thanks, sir. I'll just give a quick report from the work we've been doing in Scotland. So in the past weekend, well over 10,000 people, overwhelmingly young people, took part in a series of inspiring Black Lives Matter events in Scotland. And the spark for this, as others have said, was the brutal murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis on the 25th of May. But as others have pointed out, that was just the straw that broke the camel's back, if you like. And since that, we've seen a qualitative change in the situation, and we've seen a global youth uprising, if you like, against systemic racism and state brutality. But also, as other comrades have said, young people searching for what kind of society do we need to build. So Glasgow Green and Holyrood Park in Edinburgh saw at least 5,000 protesters at each venue, with a massive turnout from a Black, Asian and mixed ethnicity community in Scotland, alongside thousands of white youth determined to protest racism. In Dundee, also where I live, 250 attended a protest in the city square that was called by Young Socialists, a youth organisation, after a previous event had been called off. Now, significantly, these protests went ahead despite a concerted campaign to have them cancelled in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the Scottish Government, Police Scotland and leading SNP and Labour politicians all appealed to organisers to cancel and the wider public not to attend for fears the virus could be spread if they did. Now, Socialist Party Scotland put out a statement, and we responded to that last week with an appeal for the protest to go ahead. It was clear to us there was a massive mood among young people to come out and demand justice. So instead, we called for mass mobilisations, but proper PPE, social distance, etc. And we called for trade unions to provide experienced stewards on the protests, to ensure health and safety and whatever. But we also fully understood that many workers, including trade unionists, would be unlikely to attend, not least because of the battles being fought at a workplace level to resist the demand by employers to return to workplaces that are not safe. Indeed, we even advised our own members not to come to a protest if they had underlying health issues or health concerns generally. Now, Socialist Party Scotland members are on the front line in the workplaces and unions demanding no return to work until safe. In particular, the trade unions should demand agreements from employers over all aspects of health and safety in the workplace. However, it was clear that a large outdoor events would take place, and if done properly, they could minimise risk to those taking part. A number of protest rallies were called off in the run-up to the weekend. Other amended plans for city centre gatherings, Aberdeen and Inverness, and appealed instead for posters and anti-racist messages would be put up on bridges and other prominent areas. In the run-up to Sunday, the Socialist Worker Party-led Stand Up to Racism campaign had scaled back their planned protests, and instead invitation-only events were held in Glasgow and Edinburgh, where 30 or 40 were in attendance. And by the weekend, the SWP were echoing the calls from SNP and Labour politicians, as well as some trade union leaders, and organising online and individual protests. And this approach was at odds with the mood of many young people who wanted to fight. So as it was, these large protests that did take place showed that it was possible to implement both social distancing measures and to adhere to strict use of PPE. The organisers of the Edinburgh, Glasgow and Dundee events all took a very responsible approach. Masks, gloves, water, hand sanitizer, etc. was made widely available. Venues were chosen, large parks, outdoor areas that allowed for social distancing, which was meticulously adhered to by those in attendance. And the determination to speak out over the killing of George Floyd and Sheku Bayo, who was murdered, a black man murdered by police in Scotland in 2015 in Fife, and many other victims of racist state violence, was the overwhelming mood. Homemade BLM banners were widely evident. I can't breathe, and Scotland and the UK are not innocent. It was a common slogan, a reference to widespread racism in society generally. And Socialist Party Scotland and Young Socialists were the only real political group making an active intervention with an active presence at the protests. And the response to our leaflet that called for the building of a mass working class movement to smash racism was overwhelming. We ran out of leaflets, sold all of the papers. We raised over £600 in donations. Posters and petitions said "Drive out Trump," "Smash racism," "Fight for socialism," as well as quotes from Malcolm X, Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, and others. We provided hand sanitizer and gloves and everything else to everyone who came up to sign the petition. The interest in socialism amongst young people was enthusiastic, and the need to link the struggles against racism to a fight against capitalism was widely accepted. Only those most influenced by the ideas of identity politics that don't accept oppression in all its forms can only be ended by the overthrow of capitalist class society, were opposed to what we were saying. We have hundreds of names to follow up who expressed an interest in finding out more about socialism and the Young Socialist, Young Workers' Rights Campaign. Now, just a few remarks on the Dundee protest that we held. Members of Young Socialists, Young Workers' Rights Campaign in Dundee organised a socially distant protest with 250 in attendance on Sunday. This was after the larger planned protest by a Black Lives Matter group in Dundee was called off due to the pressures around COVID-19, which is understandable, but we didn't agree with that position. And many young black youth had indicated their intention to go down anyway. So we lived up to our original commitments, and we provided an open mic, a PA system, and hand sanitizer and gloves and all the rest of it, like we said we were going to do. We encouraged workers and young people to come up and speak. We had a mix of voices, old and young, and many from Black and Asian community who got up to speak about their own experiences of racism in poems and speeches, and many calls for unity. And we got dozens of names at our stall, which was mobbed again by young people agreeing with our slogans to smash racism and fight capitalism. We ran out of sign-up sheets and had to resort to scrap pieces of paper. Socialist Party Scotland members like myself and Jim McFarlane, who plays a prominent role in Unison Trade Union, spoke about the need for working class unity to smash racism. Citing examples of Black and Asian workers who are leading struggles of the organised working class around the world, as well as Dundee's own protest of leading anti-racist class struggle. And by engaging members of our crowd individually and groups, members of YS patiently explained our programme of uniting workers in order to combat racism. And the need to fight for socialism is historically rooted in all workers of all races and sexes coming together, united against capitalism and its weapons of division. And towards the end, it was difficult to get a hold of a mic. It was being passed around enthusiastically between young people. We're trying to make sure it was wiped down in between speakers and stuff, but it got a little bit out of hand. Like I said, it was mainly Black, Asian, and mixed ethnicity young people wanting to speak, and it was a vast majority of those who spoke on the mic. In the end, we held a minute of silence for George Floyd and all Black lives wrongfully taken by racists and by the state, by kneeling and raising our fists. Chants of no justice, no peace, and Black Lives Matter engulfed the city centre of Dundee. There were a few protests that tried to accuse us of co-opting Black Lives Matter, and that white socialists should not have organised the event. But like I said, the original event was cancelled, and no other organisation were willing to step in, and we felt we had to. So a majority of the crowd did not feel the same, and the overwhelming mood was for unity, and we were individually thanked by many Black and Asian teenagers and young workers at the end for organising the protest and giving them an opportunity to come down and make their feelings known. And as the protest, so as the protest came to a close, the leaflets flew out of our hands as people were hungry for ideas on where next. Invitations were given out to the successful online Socialist Party public meeting last night, where speakers from the Independent Socialist group, which Jai is affiliated to, spoke. We think we showed how to organise and host a protest safely, directing towards the need for class struggle and socialist change to solve racism and to bring about real justice. Thanks, comrades.
Thanks, Wayne. You heard the excellent report again from there, and how the Socialist Party in Scotland organised in Dundee and other places and so on. And then if you are in Scotland, if you didn't come across us up until now, if you're listening to us and you wanted to take part and join us in activities and also join the organisation, please do contact Socialist Party Scotland. And also, if you're in the US listening to us, you wanted to get involved, contact the Independent Socialist group. But in England and Wales, wherever you are, if you haven't really joined to take part in these activities or find out what you can do, please do contact Socialist Party. You can Google it and you can get across our website and then contact us, and we will definitely respond. I just want to kind of move on a little bit. Before we move on, if you are not liked the Facebook page, our Facebook page, please do. And then most importantly, go to this YouTube channel and subscribe. And we do need all the support we can get from you, so that you can really, every week we want to bring this broadcast to you from various parts of the world, wherever the struggle happens, and our comrades, we take part in it, and then you will get an immediate report, unlike any other bourgeois media that exists at the moment. I wanted to bring in Jai to discuss a bit more, develop into kind of what's going on. Just one question, Jai, is that what's the difference between the kind of protest, Black Lives Matter, BLM protest taking place right now, and what took place before, during the Obama time? Remember, the BLM name itself came up in the Obama period, Obama administrations. What's the difference, and what's the role of BLM now and its strength and weakness? Can you give us a little bit of details on that, Jai, if you're still there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
So really the previous BLM sort of mood really grew out of the 2013 killing of an unarmed black teenager named Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of his murderer. It became this major social media hashtag, but it materialized as an actual organization and as an on-the-ground force after the events in 2014, after the events of the police murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And the police and military response to these recent protests, in contradiction to back in 2014, has been much more aggressive and much more brutal. Back in 2014, Obama made these sort of platitudes and used the Democratic Party and its apparatus to try and quell, and effectively did, diffuse some of the anger, promising, minor reforms like body cameras and, investigating these police departments. But in reality, it did very little to actually fundamentally change the nature of how policing functioned. But much of this movement actually, quite ironically, faded out over time, kind of wrapping up during the early period of actually Trump's presidency, as the BLM mood or movement in its early days got further and further absorbed into the Democratic Party. It became less and less of a real, solid on the ground force. What we're seeing right now is obviously very different. Right now, Black Lives Matter as a slogan still dominates protest signs and is a large banner for changes to the system. But at the same time, what sort of existed previously as Black Lives Matter does not have the same sway over the movement. And in many senses, it is, in many areas, has become largely defunct. There are new sort of slogans and demands being put forward that are much more actually concrete than anything we've seen previously in the previous moment, most notably being the concrete demand of defunding the police, in which a lot of workers, and demilitarizing the police as well, which a lot of workers and youth are organizing around and uniting around, essentially investing much of these funds, that these massively bloated budgets, like for example in LA, over $3 billion a year is spent on the LAPD, or in New York City, it's $6 billion, right? Using these massively expanded police budgets and instead, cutting them majorly, and instead investing in, non-law enforcement means and programs that can better meet the needs of the community. Like so many of the things that police respond to don't require a person with a gun that is going to escalate the situation, right? They require mental health services, right? They require basic social work. They require just basic things like housing and better jobs to really try and undercut poverty that is what breeds a lot of this violence in the first place, rather than continuing to just put more and more money into the police while cutting all other forms of social programs, as has been really the status quo for the past few decades.
That's very good, Jai. This important point in terms of how the kind of movement changed, and in terms of advanced, in terms of including the economic demands, in terms of better housing, investment, and then regulation, and also connecting the kind of fight against racism is also a fight for economic equality. And without it, how can you really change the situation, and connecting to the system and so on? When we're talking about the current, the US government and the capitalist system, is that this movement is so kind of powerful that it kind of also played a role in terms of splitting the capitalism in the top. Basically, they were using, Trump is issuing like a death threat, basically, we'll shoot you, basically saying, like if the riot starting, the shooting starts, basically it's a death threat to the protesters. And moving the National Guard, talking about moving the military, etc. It's backfired big time, and they have to take back from implementing the National Guard and so on and so forth. it reflects the division in kind of that emerged in the ruling class. And can you give us a little bit details in terms of how far deep it is and what's the situation now?
Yeah, certainly. The heavy-handed response of the police departments and the Trump administration has, like you said, very much backfired. It has really only added steam to the protests instead of extinguishing them as it was intended. As I said before, these protests against police brutality have just been met with more police brutality. And now, when the corporate media can't just continue spinning, I mean, they do continue to spin their narrative, but now there is social media that can document what is actually happening on the ground and that can dispel these narratives that too often just reproduce whatever the police are claiming. And during this movement, these serious acts of violence continue to be committed. Already, at least 11 people have been murdered by police during these protests against police murder. And many more have been seriously injured and hospitalized and will probably receive damage, especially brain damage, that they will never recover from. Including a 75-year-old man in Buffalo who was shoved to the ground completely unprovoked by police. He was literally alone, walked up to a police officer, shoved to the ground. We've seen tens of thousands of people beaten and brutalized with tear gas and pepper spray and rubber bullets. And we've also seen at least 10,000 protesters being arrested. And so now Trump is seeking to further escalate this. But again, this has only emboldened the movement. Trump is seeking now to further escalate this and threatening to use the Insurrection Act to call in not just the National Guard, but the army as well, and other sections of the military to try and put down the protests for good, effectively threatening war. And even his own cabinet has broken ranks with him. Most notably, his Secretary of Defense, basically the warmonger in chief after the president, has correctly identified how deeply polarizing this move would be, and understands that it could heighten the struggle and backfire on the Trump administration even more. Just further discrediting U.S. capitalism that is already largely on the back foot. At our interventions as well, similar to in England and Wales, there's this widespread interest in socialist ideas, and our program and our struggle for a movement to build an independent workers' party and get organized has gotten an incredible echo at these rallies. And this sort of heavy-handed approach, essentially declaring war on his own citizens, would seriously undercut and further the polarization and further discredit capitalism that is already massively on the back foot.
It's absolutely clear in terms of how far the movement's developed in the US. From what Jai was saying. I want to bring in Isai also to kind of ask the question about what's going on in England and Wales. What's the mood there in terms of how much change the situation here is? Because in the corona crisis, like Isai explained earlier, it's emerged that how the condition the Black and Asian workers are living has had a huge impact in terms of their lives, a number of people dead, etc., etc. And also there is a generalized anger against the Tory government. All this is expressed in the movement, I think. But I'll bring in Isai. Can you give us a little bit details about that?
No, definitely. It's their anger at the Tories is also seen in these protests. But because at the moment they are largely leaderless and spontaneous, it hasn't really expressed in that way, but there have been a chance of anti-Boris chants, for example, which has came up during the protest as well. And the other interesting thing that came up was when conversation came up in terms of what kind of movement that we want to build. And it's inevitable in these kind of protests that the question of identity politics does come up, and we had to deal with them as well. On a very minor level, we had one or two angry protesters coming up, which was like not even a percentage of the percentage in terms of the conversation we had with people that came up and had a go at us saying socialists shouldn't be here, this is not about socialism, this is about Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter is not political, and we would completely disagree with them. Black Lives Matter, the expression that came through this is very much political, and as has been explained by Deji as well, which I think has been a really important contribution in terms of the mood amongst the protesters, is an indication that it is actually very much interested in socialist ideas and a very different level of youth that we're talking to. But I do think it's important to address that question in terms of who are the representatives for the movement. I think Deji mentioned his Starmer, which It's very interesting because not long ago we were kind of, I think Keir Starmer was playing the game where's Keir Starmer, trying to find him because he's been so quiet on a number of issues, and now he comes out and says it's wrong that the statue got pulled down, but it should have never been there in the first place. So what the hell are you trying to say? It's almost, for me, kind of reminds me of Boris Johnson saying, in the sense that, you go to work but don't use the public transport, but if you can't use, but if you haven't got a bike or car, then go to work anyway. It's that kind of mixed message where you're not taking a position. It's almost like you're compromising with the right wing, with the capitalist class. And we would say it's completely wrong for Keir Starmer to do that, and we have no illusions in him in that sense, and we have been raising the need to build for a mass working class organizations from that as well. But just on this identity politics as well, the other person I would just briefly mention is Priti Patel, who I think is on the course of being one of the most hated Black, Asian, ethnic minority politicians in her time, because she is everything that the capitalist system represents. And some of the things that she's been saying about the protests in London, for example, and across the country, having a go at them for vandalizing, calling them thugs and criminals, proudly saying that 135 people got arrested. And we should remember that not long ago, this was like early in February, for example, that Priti Patel came under huge pressure because the senior Home Office civil servant had resigned over alleged charge of bullying from her as well, and that he was going to try and plan, he was going to sue the government as well. And we should remember all this because these are the Tory weak and being exposed in a number of ways. They are not stable government, and I think that's being more and more exposed. And partly one of the reasons I think they haven't been able to push on a more of an aggressive way in protests is because of their weakness. They are really weak and being able to do that. And just on politicians like Priti Patel and stuff like that, I just also, Rishi Sunak, Sadiq Khan, I mean, these politicians are a living example of what we've been saying, that it's not race, it's not your gender or sexuality that determines who you represent, it's your policies. We should learn the lessons of Jeremy Corbyn's movement as well. I think we should be discussing that as well in terms of what that represents. But also, I think we should be hammering home the fact that what we want is a movement that represents ordinary people, is a movement that fights for rights, including for jobs, homes and services. But also, I think in London especially, I think one of the other interesting development that's taken place is Sadiq Khan announcing today that he's going to review all the statues in London in terms of whether they're linked to slavery or plantation owners. And I think that is what they're trying to do, is diffuse the protests that are taking place, kind of coming out and trying to give crumbs and trying to give a little concession. But what they don't understand is that this movement wants not crumbs, it wants a big change. It was change that is not possible under capitalism, and so therefore the need to get rid of it is even more sharper. Sadiq Khan, we have been in the London Socialist Party, we have been challenging, and we wanted to, and we raised the need for a socialist into London City, for example. And it's not an accident that Sadiq Khan, who got elected on the background of being the son of a bus driver, is hated by bus drivers in London. He's absolutely hated by bus drivers, and these are largely Black and Asian bus drivers, and they hate him because he does not represent them and he does not act in their interests. We had a member, for example, Mo, recently during the pandemic, who did a battle to get the front doors closed, and that for us is an example of what a organized workers movement can do during this period. And Khan originally was against that idea because it was a loss of revenue, but then under pressure had to quickly retreat his program, otherwise he would have been under massive attack. And so it is significant that these politicians are going to try and get in. And I think it's also indication that the Tories, especially the fact that they're trying to use Black, Asian, ethnic minorities politicians to carry through their brutal attack on the working class, is an indication of also the identity politics that they're playing as well. And just in terms of like, I think I completely agree with the point that Deji rate in terms of in London, including in London, the police hasn't been heavy-handed as in the US not in the same scale at all. But we did have riot police at the protests in London, but they have been hesitant because the protests have been massive, and so they've been really hesitant to do anything. However, as things develop, they are going to change that, and they're going to try and come more heavy. And I think it's very important that we raise the need for democratic stewarding and safety, which are absolutely crucial. But one of the main tasks that we have in front of us as socialists is to give a political lead to this movement, to put forward a clear program and demand on how we can build a united mass
on that
movement.
point, Isai, let me ask you one question, because you made an important point before we move into that. It's about this kind of this Asian. I mean, it come up during the shooting of Mark Dungan and the protest and some of the riots that took place, the role of David Lamy in it, and etc. and so on. So and this what's the strategy? Just very shortly, I think you're going to go into that discussion. Explain a little bit what's the strategies needed, what's the lesson we have to take from it, because when you just say that, oh, this is about just black, it's generally it is a problem. Just about Asian, it's a problem. It is these people like Priti Patel that you mentioned. Just the mention of that name is enough to create anger among a lot of Asian youth at this stage. So the idea of BLM, the kind of Black Lives Matter sort of the identity politics, is challenged to kind of indicate which strategy they should travel towards. Also, can you include that in what you're saying?
No, thank you, Senan. And you're right. And we shouldn't reinvent the wheel, because the movement against racism has been happening. We have seen massive civil rights movement, for example, in the 50s and 60s. And 70s, which shook America to its core, not just America, but across the world. And we've seen Race Equality Act, for example, coming in the UK as a result of it. But also it has also brought in a layer of black activists and who came to the fore. And we've also already mentioned Malcolm X, for example, or the Black Panthers, for example, where they already, because they were fighting black liberation, and they kind of came to the conclusion when a brick wall that you can't achieve that under capitalism. And then, it's no accident that Malcolm X has said that you can't have capitalism without racism. The need to fight against this whole system is absolutely crucial. And I think that's the lesson that this movement had to take, is that what kind of program is necessary to defeat and to end racism completely, as well as to fighting for the rights of black, Asian and ethnic minorities. And we would say such a movement needs to put forward a clear demand and need to link with the workers' movement against exploitation, poverty and class inequality. Because we say in the Socialist Party, for example, at the moment there are two main important tasks ahead of us. First of all, in terms of the protests that are taking place, it's important for us to put forward those socialist ideas, as DG said, to educate and organize these young people on a socialist basis, the need to put forward a common program to end capitalism and exploitation. But also I think we got a really important task to, because we as a socialists and in the Socialist Party, we defend and are confident in the organized working class as the force in society that can get rid of capitalism. And that we need to start raising amongst the trade unions. An urgent task for us now is to raise amongst the trade unions, whether in a local, regional, or national level, where they are meeting, either virtually at the moment, to pass motion, first of all supporting these protests that are taking place on a mass scale, but also we would say most importantly that the trade union movement needs to be the backbone of the struggle against racism and against poverty and unemployment. And that means that the trade union movement needs to take up the Tories and the right wing of the Labour Party to fight against job losses, for example. And when that situation comes, they need to boldly call for nationalising companies to defend those jobs. They need to fight for mass council homes, for better working conditions. And we would echo the point that we made in 2018. The Socialist Party in England and Wales played a leading role through our members in the trade union. It was our comrades in the Unite Union has put forward a motion, which is now the policies of the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, which is calling on for launch a Jobs, Homes, Not Racism campaign to unite the wider trade union movement and to effectively campaign against the far right. These are the wording of the Trade Union Congress motion that was passed at the 2018 TUC, and we urgently call the TUC and the trade union to act on that. Massively important now, because as has been mentioned, the DFLA is trying to get trying to stir, and it's helped by right-wing politicians, and I would include Priti Patel in that list, of stirring these ideas that these protesters are violent, and also the fact that but they are feeding on those ideas, and DFLA has racist core as an organization, and we need to get together to prevent that and to organize effectively against that movement, against the DFLA as well as all these far rights organizations. And just on a very point that I would end by saying is that we are living in historic period, and we have seen the working class youth on the streets, but we are confident that when the giant of the organized working class, the workers, come out and support this impressive, inspiring movement that's taking place, then things will change. That is the power that can change society and ultimately get rid of capitalism and all exploitation get rid of racism, and all exploitation under capitalism.
Thanks, Isaiah. You put forward a number of programmatic points that the movement should take into consideration, take forward. Before I ask Jai about the program, I just wanted to connect with the kind of earlier point that Isai mentioned, which is actually originated from US to defeat the civil rights movement in the past, kind of developing a black elite, incorporating them into the system, and so on. Did it work, and how it helped to kind of sustain the bad condition for the black and other minority population in the country, and also what lessons we should take from it? Jai.
Yeah, certainly. I think, first of all, I think this sort of this elevation of sort of a black elite that you sort of allude to, I think it's fundamentally, we have to understand it as a divide and conquer tactic, right? The most revolutionary black leaders during the civil rights movement that were seen as a threat to the capitalist class, particularly because they were, moving towards or firmly in sort of working class, socialist conclusions that we need solidarity, along, seeing through those lines of race and gender and all other forms of repression, and fundamentally uniting ourselves, assassinating figures like MLK, like Malcolm X, like Fred Hampton, who was killed particularly by police violence, actually. While at the same time elevating and sort of pacifying the movement by, creating this sort of black elite to try and avoid and sort of insulate from further unrest, which, would allow some Black Americans to sort of elevate their economic position, and this is been held up as sort of progress. But in reality, it's really nothing more than a stick to beat the Black working class with for supposedly not working hard enough, because they are not the Ben Carsons or I'm blanking on the Supreme Court justice's name, but you get the idea, or the Obamas, or etc. But to further to this point, the reality, is that having this huge number, there's still a huge number, and the vast majority of Black people in the US, remain stuck in poverty, are hugely exploited at work. They face enormous repression by the criminal justice system and discrimination, racist policing, mass incarceration, and also, as similar to what is going on in the UK, an incredibly disproportionate impact of death due to coronavirus. And not just the Black population, but the Latino population as well. Massive disparities in the rates of people dying. In Milwaukee, which has which is around 25% Black, the number of people died. Black people make up about 80% of the deaths in Milwaukee. Just to give you a clear example of how deep these disparities run. and they're concretely rooted in how racism and economic insecurity and led and caused by capitalism intersect to create vicious repression and violence that isn't always in a physical sense. And having a black president, having Obama, didn't fix these problems. In fact, Obama made zero serious attempts to undo any of the elements of systemic racism, despite riding on his identity as a black man to promise and change in order to get elected. But in reality, we got no change. We got lip service, and we got more of the same. We got half-assed investigations into police departments that merely gave suggestions and not real concrete policy changes, right? We got Obama implementing the same, in some cases more, austerity and bailing out of corporations, right? Because he was fundamentally supports capitalism, and that relation to what policies he supports and whose side he is on is what matters, not the color of his skin. And so the lessons that the movement has to take is to fight these policies, is to fight for policies that benefit, the mass of the black workers and youth, right, as well as the rest of the working class, and can unite our program to build unity. And that fundamentally you must reject misleadership of black politicians and haughty black academics that seek to direct the movement into just voting blue and trying to stop short of any serious change. To paraphrase Malcolm X briefly, in this current U.S. political system that we live in this corporate duopoly, black people can either be consumed by either the liberal fox or the conservative wolf. But either way, black people will be eaten. Right? We need our own party that is independent of corporate money and based firmly in the working class and the youth, with trade unions and community organizations developing solidarity and serving as sort of a solid political base of struggle to fight against austerity, to fight against capitalism, and to fight for a socialist future, and unite our class around and against racism and all forms of repression, and against capitalism for that matter. And it needs, this party needs to have democratic structures and accountability and a clear program that can unite workers to defeat both capitalist major parties.
Can you elaborate on that program a little bit more in terms of why, we're running out of time, but it's also important to kind of discuss a little bit of the program, a little bit elaborate in terms of the importance of the building a mass movement, and also the why we argue the necessity of involving workers' organizations, and also setting up various committees, etc., and so on, and then turning towards challenging the system itself. Can you, because that's a kind of a situation that is emerging, like earlier Deji pointed out, like many are taking lessons from the Panthers movement and also reading Marx, etc. A lot of young people started to read Marx and so on. So can you just elaborate on that particular points a little bit more, please?
Sure, yeah. Well, firstly, I'll say, to go into the demands a bit, there are a lot of them, but some of the major ones, the point as a socialist organization is to use our demands to pierce the ideological armor of capitalism, to demonstrate what needs to happen and what could be possible, and draw out that contradiction of why are these things not already present under the capitalist system? Well, because it is fundamentally inhumane and built on the backs of racism, and it's deeply embedded within the fabric of how it functions, right? So a fight to end racial profiling and broken windows policing, the most basic demand you could think of, right? That so clearly is in place and is disproportionately affecting Black and brown people in the US. And attempts to truly try and end these policies have actually been curtailed by, not just by Republicans, but by Democrats as well for decades at this point. Fighting to just do basic things like prosecute cops when they murder people, right? Past and present. Not the conviction rate, but just simply placing actual murder charges on police that kill unarmed people is less than 2% of the time that they're even given charges. That obviously is such a most basic aspect of accountability, because these cops are allowed to continue serving and continue to kill more people, as is the case with George Floyd's murderer, Derek Chauvin, who had killed before. Fighting for community control of the police, through democratically elected committees of workers and community members with real hiring and firing power, the ability to review and create policy, to control the budget, and the authority to conduct independent investigations into police misconduct. Because clearly the criminal justice system is incapable and unwilling to truly investigate itself. And if the role of the police is truly to defend and protect and serve, then there should be no issue with subjecting the police to the actual control of the workers wholeheartedly. Fighting to demilitarize the police and defund the police, and instead invest often millions in many cities, but billions in some of these major ones as well, into actual services that are going to fight against poverty and fight against crime in a real sense, by fighting for housing, fighting for jobs, fighting for better mental health and EMT services, reducing the involvement of police in these basic things in which they are not helpful and fundamentally more often than not kill people. And doing this through, not just uniting with the movement for fighting for a workers' party, as I said before, but, we need neighborhood committees of this anti-racist movement that can discuss the strategy and the tactics of the movement, and that can build ties and fight alongside and convince and battle for the trade union movement to enter wholeheartedly into this struggle. And fighting for workplace committees, within the unionized workforce that have, relative levels of protection against this sorts of retaliation from the bosses, to begin to organize, from the rank and file, from the ground up, how best to support and intervene in the movement. And we've already seen beginnings of instinctively of rank and file union members fighting for the union to take an active role in supporting the movement with, and particularly, we're having often unionized nurses and healthcare workers, or particularly nurses, acting as protest medics, right? We're having bus drivers in Minneapolis and New York City refusing to transport police or arrested protesters, and fighting, and these unionized workforces fighting to get all city bus systems, all unionized bus systems to do the same. Unionized teachers are entering into the movement and fighting to keep police out of our schools, out of our high schools and middle schools, which is happening, not just in Minneapolis that sort of started this, but also in Worcester and New York and LA and all over the country. But fundamentally, to get to this sort of broader point, racism cannot be truly defeated under capitalism, right? As Malcolm X, the Black Panthers and Martin Luther King, they all came to the realization that a fight against racism necessitates a fight against the capitalist system that created racism in the first place, right? That is so deeply embedded, a system built on the transatlantic slave trade and the genocide of indigenous peoples in order to create and expand the system to being powerful and being able to overthrow the feudal system for good, required the unpaid labor and the vicious brutalization and genocide, frankly. So in order to win, and as long as capitalism continues to benefit from racism, which it always will, as it allows it to divide the working class, it allows capitalism to further exploit different sections of the working class, increasing their profits. So long as those conditions continue to facilitate capitalism's continuing, it will not seriously dismantle racism. We can and should fight for the immediate demands that will struggle against sort of the ways in which systemic racism is built into, and many of the demands that we put forward and more do this. But in order to win, beyond these, basic, most immediate demands through, strikes and protests, in order to win the broader dismantling of our entire racist system, we need a movement independent of the two parties of big business that is well organized and politically developed, that can take the form of a workers' party as its organized expression, that can fight to win systemic change, not just fighting against racism, but fighting for socialism, with putting power firmly in the hands of the working people instead of the millionaire politicians and the billionaire bosses that continue to rely on racism, in fact, to win their elections and to whip up and divide the working class, as Trump and as many Democrats continue to and have done in the past.
Thanks a lot, Jai. And unfortunately, there are a lot more to discuss in terms of the program, some of the points that you put forward and so on. We will bring more discussion to the viewers. Thanks for sticking with us, even though a little bit go over the time. And before you all go, I want to make a very important request, because if you watch it, all these discussions are very, very important discussions. If you like it, if you're not part of us, first thing we will ask you is to join us. And even if you are really thinking of joining, want to discuss, contact us. And then there is a lot more coming. There's going to be a lot more movement developing. Take part in it. Take part in it to change the world for benefit for everybody. And also, in order to bring this program and this kind of reports and discussion to you, we need all the support that we can get from you. Particularly, we need to kind of develop our resources a bit better. Just donate money, however small it may be. You can go to patreon.com and /CWI. You can choose to donate in terms of different options are there. Become a Patreon and support this particular work. We will request you to do that. And also, you can also donate via PayPal by going paypal.me/donate to CWI. 2 is in number. But also visit the website. You can see on the screen now the details. You can also visit the website socialistworld.net and then click on the donate as well. And also please make sure that you subscribe to the channel in YouTube, CWI Media, but also find us on Instagram in Socialist World, and in Facebook, of course, Socialist World /CWI. Make sure that you spread this word among your friends and others etc. And then Twitter, CWI Socialist. So we will bring another program next Tuesday discussing various other aspects. And as I said earlier, this is kind of a broadcast from this Committee for Workers International. What we're trying to do is to bring together the activists who are involved lively in the struggle that is emerging and also organizing. So it is a different kind of a test you get listening directly from them, but understanding what are the demands that put forward, etc., which is something that you would not get anywhere else. So please come and listen to us, take part with us, and then we'll see you next week. Thank you.